The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government.
In 1965 and 1966, the Indonesian military intentionally killed approximately 1 million innocent civilians with the active, enthusiastic participation of the United States government. My name is Vincent Bevins, and I wrote The Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade and the mass murder program that shaped our world.
Journalist Vincent Bevins explains how a U.S.-sponsored disinformation campaign was used around the world with deadly results.
The Jakarta Method is the intentional mass murder of leftists or people accused of being leftists. And this was employed throughout the world in the Cold War. And the most important part of this story, no, not the first event in the tale, is the US-backed mass murder of approximately 1 million innocent civilians in Indonesia in 1965. This massacre was one of the most important turning points of the Cold War, one of the biggest successes for the West and its allies. And it was such a big success that it inspired movements elsewhere around the world, specifically in Latin America, to copy the tactics employed there. And they used the word Jakarta to denote what they were going to do to their own leftists or accused leftists, which was to kill them.
What happened in Indonesia began on October 1st, 1965, with a military coup.
Some members of the Indonesian military that believe or say that they believe that their superior officers are organizing a right-wing coup kidnap some of them, and 6 generals end up dead. This is all very mysterious. But what we know very well is that immediately afterwards, a general named Suharto takes control of the country, ignoring direct orders from President Sukarno, and immediately gets the full backing of the United States materially and ideologically as he begins to spread a horrible story that the Indonesian Communist Party was responsible for this and had engaged in horrible torture of these 6 generals.
Declassified documents show the U.S. government was not just aware of what was happening, it helped.
The United States government immediately gave communications materials to Suharto that he used to coordinate his message around the country. Basically, I'm in charge. The PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, is to blame for this, and they must be crushed. And also, the United States successfully pressured Western media outlets, including BBC, and ended up getting the supportive outlets like the New York Times and Time Magazine to spread this story that the Indonesian Communist Party, specifically the women's wing of the party, which was at the time one of the largest feminist organizations in the world, had taken these 6 generals and performed a bizarre kind of tantric, satanic torture ritual in which they literally castrated these Indonesian men and threw them into a well.
The coup was just beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, leftists and members of the Communist Party were targeted.
This propaganda story, spread with the enthusiastic help of the United States, was used to justify the mass arrest of the Indonesian left and people accused of being on the Indonesian left. At least 1 million, perhaps 2 or 3 million people were arrested. And then over the next 5 to 6 months, in the middle of the night, some of these prisoners would be taken out, executed, and thrown into rivers.
In Indonesia, anti-communist riots shake the country.
The violence took place in different ways across Indonesia. In general, it moved west and then towards the east, across the island of Java, the most populous island in the country, but then arriving in Bali, which probably experienced the most horrific violence and the largest number of people killed compared to the total population. So we think that probably at least 5% of the population of Bali was killed in 1965 and 1966. And this mass murder not only made the emergence of a tourist industry on this beautiful island possible, the victims are still often buried on the sand underneath the very hotels where Australian surfers or American eco-tourists are staying and sipping on coconuts, right? So this history is quite literally buried in this part of the world. They still are finding bones in the sand, just feet away from where people are posing for Instagram bikini shots.
What happened in Indonesia would soon be replicated in other countries.
Small countries in which outside alien hands have planted the seeds of subversion.
It was very well understood at the time by US foreign policy officials that Indonesia was far more important than Vietnam. And this was, for the other side of the world's political spectrum, the side of the radical anti-communists and the US allied dictators, this was an inspirational achievement. This was something that they could do in their own backyards. And not only would it work, as it clearly worked in Indonesia, they would get the full backing of the United States as they attempted to launder their own reputations afterwards.
Frankly, Mr. Ambassador, we lack the trained men who would be able to plan and implement operations in an area we think is vitally important. Because of this, we are also requesting that your team of advisors include a senior officer who is thoroughly experienced in psychological operations.
Very well, sir. I think we can provide you with an expert on the subject.
In the early 1970s, in both Brazil and Chile, you see right-wing forces in both countries using the word Jakarta, Jakarta in Spanish or Jakarta in Portuguese, to signify something that they were going to do to their own left-wing problem. In Brazil, you had something behind the scenes called Operação Jakarta, or just Operation Jakarta, which was a similar program to eliminate the left. And in Santiago, the capital of Chile, you had this a quite chilling terror campaign, which consisted of graffiti showing up on the homes of leftists or accused leftists that said simply, "Jakarta is coming." And for anybody paying attention in the Cold War at the time, it was very obvious what that meant. It meant, we're going to kill you, just like the Indonesians killed their own communists. In 1973, this is exactly what happened. Jakarta, very tragically, did come to South America. With the success of the US-backed coup that overthrew Salvador Allende and installed Augusto Pinochet, thousands of leftists and accused leftists were killed. And then Brazil and Chile got together to form a international mass murder network called Operation Condor, which identified and eliminated their enemies, especially on the left, but not only on the left. I find that in at least 20 countries, US allies employ the intentional mass murder of civilians in the construction of a US-backed authoritarian capitalist regime. And I find that this tactic, this Jakarta Method, was such an important part of the way that the Cold War was won, that it profoundly shaped the world that we live in today.
On a rainy day in Washington, pomp and ceremony attend the formal reception of Philippine President Ferdinand E. Marcos. President Marcos begins his state visit with high praise for President Johnson's firm stand in Asia.
Countries like Brazil, Philippines, Indonesia, all throughout Central America, still have these intensely violent and intensely effective anti-communist myths, often based on explicit lies going back well into the beginning of the 20th century. And Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, is a great example. He came to power on the explicit promise that he would resuscitate the ideology of Brazil's dictatorship. And he had said very explicitly out loud on television that it would require the murder of 30,000 innocent Brazilians in order for the country to move forward.
The Jakarta Method even influenced domestic politics in the U.S.
One very often overlooked part of this story is that young Barack Obama moved to Indonesia in the late 60s because of this mass murder. His stepfather was called back to Jakarta, as were many Indonesians that were living abroad during this turbulent time. And he and his mother went with him. That's why Barack Obama lived for a time in Indonesia. That's where these rumors that he was a Muslim came from, just because he was living in a Muslim country at the time. I think that Barack Obama's early life was profoundly shaped by this experience in living in a country that had just been torn apart by this kind of horrible violence.
The violence made possible by the Jakarta Method can't be undone, but Bevin says it's tempting to think about what might have been.
The world that we live in was shaped by a specific type of horrible violence. And if the world is like this because of that type of horrible thing that we would wish never happened and we would hope never happened again, that leads me to think what a world would be like that was not shaped by this violence. What possibilities for human history could lay before us if we rejected this kind of terrible repression as a way to get what we want politically.
This is Inside Edition Digital.